In the days after the Brazilian Grand Prix, a Kuwait Airways Boeing 747 with 3 members of the Kuwaiti royal family on board was hijacked en route from Bangkok to Kuwait City by Lebanese guerrillas who demanded the release of 17 prisoners being held after setting off bombs in Kuwait 5 years earlier. The flight was initially diverted to Iran, and negotiations began with hostages being released, but things broke down because of Kuwait's support for Iraq in the ongoing war, and the plane was forced to take off again. They were then refused landing permission in both Lebanon and Syria, before finally being allowed to land in Cyprus. By now, the hijackers were becoming frustrated. 2 hostages were killed and their bodies thrown from the plane as the terrorists demanded refuelling, and they insisted ground control referred to them as the plane of the great martyrs, which worried everyone. Eventually, the Cypriot authorities washed their hands of the affair, allowed the refuelling to take place, and the plane took off once more, this time having pre-arranged landing permission in Algiers. Things again reached an impasse, with the Kuwaiti government refusing to discuss releasing the prisoners, until finally the martyrs gave up and surrendered. The whole ordeal had taken 16 days and crossed 3 continents, making it one of the world's longest skyjackings, and at one point the Kuwait national football team had offered to take the place of the hostages on the aircraft. If that wasn't enough to discourage people from flying, an Aloha Airlines 737 flying a short internal hop in Hawaii suffered a catastrophic failure when poor maintenance and metal fatigue combined to see the roof and sides of a significant chunk of the fuselage just peel off. One unfortunate flight attendant, 58-year-old Clarabelle Lansing, was blown out of the aircraft, but miraculously the pilots managed to land the aircraft with no further fatalities and just 8 seriously injured. Needless to say, the incident had far-reaching implications for airline safety rules and procedures following investigations. Tensions, meanwhile, were still high in the Persian Gulf, where a US frigate, the Samuel B. Roberts, struck an Iranian naval mine while on duty escorting Kuwaiti oil tankers, severely damaging her, but fortunately with no fatalities. In response, the US Navy launched attacks on Iranian naval assets, with Navy aircraft sinking the frigate Sahand and several smaller vessels. Shore installations and platforms were also attacked, for the cost of 1 crashed helicopter with 2 crew killed. Although much less well known than others, it was the largest surface engagement the US Navy had fought since World War II, including Korea and Vietnam, and some naval historians have argued that it marks the establishment of the US as the primary naval power in the world. There was at least one bit of good news. Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signed the Geneva Accords, with the Soviet Union promising to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, despite the US having reneged on a previous agreement to stop supplying the Mujahideen with weapons. This was politely ignored by Gorbachev in order to achieve his goal of getting out of Afghanistan, but the Mujahideen guerrillas themselves were not parties to the agreement and would continue their campaign against the Soviet-backed government of Mohammad Najibullah. With a month between races, and with the next race back home in Europe, most teams were able to do work on their cars before the San Marino Grand Prix. Lotus headed back to their wind tunnel and did some testing at Monza. Williams continued working on their reactive suspension system, though Mansell still wasn't entirely happy with it. Ozella remounted their engine in a sufficiently different position for it to be deemed a new chassis model when they turned up at Imola. Unfortunately, since said new chassis hadn't passed FIA crash testing, the team were ejected from the event, which was awful news for them and great news for the new teams, who wouldn't have to go through pre-qualifying that week. Tyrrell lengthened the wheelbase, as Jonathan Palmer explained to the BBC.
The problem was that the car was too slow by about 3 seconds a lap. It was difficult to drive. It didn't have enough grip for the amount of drag it had in a straight line. You know, we can always pile on more wing to get more grip, but then you go slower down the straight. We've actually increased the wheelbase of the car by putting in an 8-inch spacer, you can see there, between the engine and gearbox, and that's had a beneficial effect too, making the car a little bit quicker and a little bit easier to drive.
Well, you've driven it at Imola. Is it better? Is it good enough?
It's not good enough, no, but it is better.
Ligier had completely redesigned their suspension after problems in Rio, and Scuderia Italia had their purpose-built Dallara chassis ready for Alex Caffey. But the cars everyone was here to see were the other red ones, Alboreto and Berger in the Ferraris. After the great end to 1987 and a strong performance in Rio, the Tifosi were more optimistic than they'd been in some time. It didn't last long. In changeable conditions, the McLarens absolutely demolished everyone else in qualifying in both wet and dry conditions, with Senna taking pole once again with Prost alongside, remarkably only the 3rd front row lockout in the McLaren team's long history. Nelson Piquet was third and fastest through the speed traps, but a whopping 3.4 seconds off pole, with Nannini an excellent fourth and fastest atmospheric only a tenth off Piquet. Berger was an unhappy fifth, alongside Patresi's Williams, with Cheever also looking positive in the Arrows, seventh. Boutsen was eighth and Capelli an excellent ninth, ahead of a deeply demoralised Alboreto in 10th. Mansell and Nakajima shared row 6, just ahead of Streff, whose AGS, now in a black and yellow livery, was again running well and proving that his good Rio qualifying wasn't a fluke. Likewise, De Cesaris put the Real 16th, Tarquini an encouraging 17th in the Coloni, Julian Bailey made his Grand Prix debut from 21st, ahead of his teammate Palmer. Caffey put the new Dallara 24th, Ginzani and Modena making up the back row, with Larrauri, Schneider, Johansson and Arnoux missing the cut. Wait, both Ligiers? Yes, the new suspension was apparently even worse than the old one, and for the first time in the team's 12-year history they had failed to qualify both cars, both over 8.5 seconds off the pace, a particularly bitter pill to swallow for the drivers given Arnoux had sat on pole here 3 times and Johansson had finished in the points in 1985, 86 and 87. Andrea De Cesaris' Real developed a suspension problem on the warm-up lap and would start from the pit lane, so the 25 remaining cars lined up after the parade lap in clear dry weather and away they went. Or at least most of them did. Prost stalled his engine as he accelerated away, but had enough forward momentum to bump start it and got away in the middle of the pack, while Alboreto had a slipping clutch and dropped back to 23rd. So as they headed into Tosa, Senna led Piquet with Patrese nicking third off Nannini, Berger in fifth and Prost passing Cheever for sixth going up the hill. Senna immediately got his foot down and started leaving Piquet and the rest behind. He was already 4.3 seconds ahead at the end of lap 2. Behind Piquet there was plenty of jostling for position as Berger made his way ahead of Nannini, followed through by Prost. Capelli's fine qualifying was again undone, this time by a gearbox problem on lap 3, joining De Cesaris in retirement, whose suspension had given way again on the first lap. Senna continued pulling away at a rapid rate, as Piquet led a small clutch of cars consisting of Patrese, Berger, Prost and Nannini, with Cheever and Boutsen just behind. Prost moved up another place past Berger, only to immediately lose it again, and then retake it again, going up the hill from Villeneuve. The next lap he was past Patrese into third and beginning to chase down Piquet's Lotus. Patrese meanwhile now had Berger in his mirrors, as they already had begun to lap some of the tail-enders. Berger, though, had his own problems, as Nannini now drove up behind him and began looking for a way through, which he found on lap 8, shortly before Prost breezed past Piquet to take second. There will have been grim faces in the Lotus pit given the cars had identical engines. So at the end of that lap, Senna led Prost by just over 8 seconds, with Piquet third, then Patrese, Nannini and Berger, with Boutsen, Cheever and Mansell together a little way behind them. As Prost sped up to catch Senna, the Brazilian sped up in turn to preserve his lead, while Ron Dennis kept an eye on the fuel consumption statistics. Meanwhile, Nannini had got right on Patrese's tail and was looking for an opening, and the 2 atmospheric cars were still close behind the turbocharged Lotus of Piquet. Patrese, of course, wasn't going to make it easy for his fellow countrymen, while behind them the other Benetton of Boutsen was catching Berger. The Belgian passed his old Arrows teammate on lap 15, while Nannini was still stuck behind Patrese, and Mansell was now looming in Berger's mirrors too. Nannini, meanwhile, was trying everything to get past Patrese, but the veteran was never an easy man to pass at the best of times, and used all his experience to hang on to his 4th place. Soon the other Benetton had joined Sandro too, and the pair were clearly being held up by the Williams. While the cameras were watching that, Mansell nipped past Berger into 7th and swiftly attached himself to the back of the Patrese train. As they all lapped Modena's Eurobrunn on lap 23, the 2 Benetton-Williams pairs were both jockeying for position, but nobody could quite get the drop on the car in front. Meanwhile, way out front, Senna was still charging away, over 8 seconds ahead of Prost, who was in turn 26 seconds ahead of Piquet. Nannini finally got past Patrese, selling him a dummy into Villeneuve as half-distance approached, and quickly cleared off after Piquet, and Boutsen didn't lose any time extracting himself from between the 2 Williamses and setting off after his upstart teammate. So would Patrese now move over for his team leader Mansell? Well, he certainly didn't block him, and Nigel was straight through, but dropping from 4th to 7th within a lap suggested there might actually be something wrong with the number 6 Williams. If the faces in the Lotus pit were glum when Prost with the same engine sailed straight past Piquet, they got even glummer as the normally aspirated Nannini charged up to the back of the turbocharged Lotus with Boutsen in tow as all three lapped Bailey in the Tyrrell. A bit of wheel bumping kept Piquet in front, but the champion was throwing everything at the wall, the back almost stepping out on him as he fought to keep the two Benettons behind him. It was an entertaining battle and much more fun to watch than the game of high-octane chess happening between Senna and Prost, both adjusting their lap times to balance fuel consumption and tyre wear with the need to pressure their opponent, tremendously absorbing for the team and drivers no doubt, but a little dull to watch on track. Piquet was clearly holding up the three behind him as he was nearly taken out by Palmer while lapping the Tyrrell. Just after half-distance, Boutsen ran a bit wide and allowed Mansell through into fifth, so it was Senna, Prost, Piquet, Nannini, Mansell and Boutsen in the top six at half-distance, with Patrese 7th, Berger 8th, Alboreto having made his way up to 9th, Chiva 10th, then Streff, Warwick and Nakajima. Piquet had turned up his boost a bit and was lapping quicker, but still couldn't pull away from a feisty Nannini as Mansell and Boutsen closed in once more. And now it was Nannini's turn to make a mistake as he lost the back end on lap 36 going into Villeneuve and swapped ends, rejoining 7th just ahead of Berger. So Mansell was now 4th and closing in on his old mate Piquet, and on the stroke of 2/3 distance he was through. But Piquet turned up the wick a bit and powered back through on the Tambirello. By now Nannini had got back past Patrese, and both had stuck themselves to the back of this group as they all streamed past Tarquini and the Coloni. Almost forgotten up front, Prost had put on a charge as the last third of the race began, only for Senna to again just go a bit faster and keep the gap at around 8 seconds. As Mansell climbed out of Aqua Minerale on lap 42, he suddenly slowed and both Benettons and Patrese surged past, leaving Mansell to cruise in with a broken Judd engine. Remarkably, he was only the 6th retirement. The early exits of De Cesaris and Capelli had since been joined by gearbox failures for Ghinzani and Caffi and a fuel system problem for Tarquini on lap 40. Mansell's teammate Patrese seemed to be having trouble as well, spending a long time stuck behind Palmer until Berger got through into 6th. By now, as Senna began his last 10 laps, he was over 10 seconds ahead of Prost, who was in turn a good minute and a half ahead of Piquet, and Senna was approaching the back of the Benettons to lap them, which he did without any trouble, and the expressions at Lotus got even grimmer as he cruised past Piquet to lap him, which will have put a smile on Ayrton's face after Nelson's comments over the winter. Prost, meanwhile, had been reeling Senna in at 5 seconds a lap while the leader was passing through the traffic, as in a sadly familiar sight, Alboreto rolled to a stop 5 laps from the end with a smoking engine. Senna nearly tripped over Modena and Campos, having their own scrap and passing an ailing Patrese, and although Prost was still flying, he was just too far back to be able to catch his teammate. Senna took his 7th career win and his first for McLaren, with Prost just 2.3 seconds behind at the end. Piquet managed to hang on to 3rd, with Boutsen, Berger and Nannini taking the remaining points. Both McLarens had lapped the entire field and pulled over in formation as soon as they crossed the line. Prost had plenty to celebrate despite having been beaten on the day. Not only did his 6 points from today's work keep him on top of the table, but it also made him the all-time top points scorer with 421.5 points, beating his former teammate Niki Lauda's total of 420.5. Piquet, meanwhile, satisfied himself with winding up Jean-Marie Balestre on the podium during the national anthems, and JMB responded by getting fed up and presenting Senna with his trophy while God Save the Queen was still playing. In a remarkably low attrition rates, 19 of the 26 cars had finished, but everyone except McLaren looked rather shell-shocked by their pace and would clearly have a lot of work to do in the coming fortnight before the next race in Monaco.